The discourse surrounding municipal fiscal management in the heart of New York City has reached a fever pitch as candidates grapple with a perennial deficit. Zohran Mamdani has stepped into the fray with a bold vision that seeks to fundamentally alter the city's economic landscape through aggressive taxation. His proponents argue that the current budgetary constraints are not merely a result of overspending but a failure to capture the immense wealth circulating at the top. On the other side of the aisle, figures like Nicole Malliotakis view this approach as a dangerous flirtation with capital flight and economic stagnation. The fundamental question remains whether the city can afford to alienate its most productive tax base in exchange for immediate social programs. Advocates for the Mamdani plan emphasize that the era of fiscal austerity has disproportionately harmed the working class while the elite thrived. They contend that a 2% surcharge on the highest earners is a negligible price for social stability and shared prosperity. This perspective suggests that the concentration of wealth at the summit of the economic pyramid is a structural flaw that requires government intervention. By redirecting these resources, the city could theoretically bolster public services that have been neglected for decades under the guise of fiscal responsibility. The narrative here is one of restorative justice, where the affluent contribute a fairer share to the collective well-being. Conversely, the viewpoint championed by Nicole Malliotakis warns that New York is already one of the most heavily taxed jurisdictions in the entire United States. She argues that adding another layer of taxation will inevitably drive high-income individuals and businesses to more tax-friendly environments like Florida or Texas. Malliotakis points out that a significant portion of the city's tax revenue is generated by a very small percentage of the population. If this group decides to relocate, the resulting budgetary hole would be catastrophic for the very services Mamdani seeks to protect. The fear is that a well-intentioned policy could trigger an exodus that hollows out the city's tax base entirely. The debate also touches upon the moral implications of using the tax code as a tool for wealth redistribution rather than revenue generation. Supporters of the proposal believe that government has a duty to mitigate extreme inequality through progressive taxation measures. They argue that the infrastructure and social order that allow the wealthy to succeed are funded by the public at large. Therefore, it is only logical that those who benefit the most from the system should pay the most to sustain it. This line of reasoning posits that economic security for the majority is the only way to ensure long-term stability for the minority. On the other hand, skeptics of this fiscal strategy emphasize the importance of market incentives and the protection of private property. They argue that penalizing success through higher taxes discourages investment and stifles the entrepreneurial spirit that defines New York City. From this perspective, the government should focus on cutting waste and improving efficiency rather than looking for new pockets to pick. They believe that a leaner, more efficient government is the true path to affordability for all residents. The clash between these two worldviews represents the core of the American political struggle over the role of the state. The proposal to align corporate tax rates with those of New Jersey is another flashpoint in this intense ideological confrontation. Mamdani supporters see this as a common-sense move to close loopholes and generate a staggering $9 billion in new revenue. They argue that corporations have enjoyed record profits while the city's infrastructure crumbles and housing becomes increasingly unaffordable. By capturing this revenue, the city could move away from the cycle of service cuts and permanent austerity measures. This shift would represent a prioritized people-over-profits approach to municipal governance that has long been absent. However, Andrew Cuomo, representing a more centrist democratic establishment view, argues that such a move would be a death knell for New York's competitiveness. He contends that the corporate environment is highly sensitive to tax fluctuations, and that firms will shift operations to neighboring states. The argument is that New York should be lowering its barriers to business to attract talent and capital, not raising them. Cuomo suggests that the projected $9 billion is a phantom figure that does not account for the loss of economic activity. The potential for job losses and reduced commercial investment is, in his view, far too high a price to pay. The discussion frequently returns to the concept of austerity and its long-term impact on the social fabric of the urban environment. Mamdani's platform is built on the rejection of the idea that there is simply not enough money to go around. His supporters argue that the scarcity is artificial, created by a political system that prioritizes the interests of the 1%. They see the proposed tax increases as a way to unlock the city's true potential and provide a safety net for all. This vision of an affordability-focused budget is meant to provide hope to those struggling with the rising cost of living. Critics like Malliotakis retort that austerity is often just another word for living within one's means, a concept that governments frequently ignore. They argue that the city's budget has grown exponentially over the last decade without a corresponding increase in the quality of services. From their perspective, the problem is not a lack of revenue but a lack of discipline in how that revenue is spent. They worry that new taxes will simply be swallowed by a bloated bureaucracy rather than reaching the people in need. The debate is thus as much about governance and accountability as it is about tax rates. As the campaign progresses, the rhetoric on both sides continues to sharpen, reflecting a deeply divided electorate. The Mamdani proposal has become a symbol of a larger movement seeking to challenge the status quo of neoliberal economics. For his followers, it is a necessary rebellion against a system that has left too many behind for too long. For his detractors, it is a reckless experiment that threatens the economic engine of the world's greatest city. Both sides agree on one thing: the outcome of this fiscal debate will shape New York for a generation. The centerpiece of Zohran Mamdani's fiscal overhaul hinges on a projected windfall of $9 billion, a figure that has sparked an intense arithmetic war in the political arena. Proponents of the plan argue that this is not merely a number pulled from thin air but a calculated assessment of untapped corporate potential. They point to the vast discrepancy between current revenue streams and the massive profits posted by multinational firms headquartered in Manhattan. By synchronizing New York's corporate tax rates with those of New Jersey, supporters claim the city can finally end its reliance on debt-heavy budgeting. This influx of capital is envisioned as the lifeline needed to pull the city's public transit and housing sectors out of a tailspin. However, Nicole Malliotakis has been vocal in her dismissal of these projections, labeling them as a socialist pipe dream that ignores the basic laws of economics. She contends that the moment New York hikes its rates to match or exceed its neighbors, the supposed $9 billion will evaporate as firms accelerate their relocation plans. Malliotakis frequently cites the recent trend of financial institutions moving their back-office operations to Florida or Tennessee, where the tax burden is significantly lighter. In her view, the $9 billion isn't a revenue target. It is a catalyst for a mass departure of the city's economic engines. She warns that chasing this sum will lead to a net loss in the city's overall tax receipts. Adding a layer of pragmatic skepticism to the mix, Andrew Cuomo has entered the discussion with a focus on the delicate balance of regional competitiveness. He argues that while New Jersey might have higher rates on paper, their overall business climate and incentive structures are vastly different from New York City's complex regulatory environment. Cuomo suggests that Mamdani's plan lacks the nuance required to understand how corporate tax legalities actually function in the tri-state area. He posits that the $9 billion figure fails to account for the elasticity of the tax base, a term used by economists to describe how people change their behavior in response to tax changes. For Cuomo, the risk of a race to the bottom or a flight to the suburbs is a far more likely outcome than a sudden budgetary surplus. The debate further intensifies when discussing the actual implementation of the 2% tax hike on the state's highest earners. Mamdani's team views this as a moral imperative, arguing that the top 1% has seen their wealth explode while the average New Yorker struggles with basic costs. They assert that the millionaire tax is a tried-and-true method of ensuring that those who benefit most from the city's infrastructure contribute to its upkeep. To them, the argument that the wealthy will leave is a form of economic blackmail used to keep the system rigged in favor of the elite. They believe that New York's unique cultural and professional appeal is far stronger than a small percentage change in a tax return. Critics like Malliotakis and Cuomo, however, find common ground in their concern over the cumulative effect of these taxes. They argue that it is not just one tax, but the death by 1,000 cuts that will eventually alienate the very people who fund the city's public schools and police force. They point out that a tiny fraction of taxpayers accounts for nearly half of the city's personal income tax revenue. If even a small percentage of this group decides that the Mamdani surcharge is the final straw, the entire fiscal house of cards could come crashing down. This fear of a tipping point is a central theme in the opposition's narrative, framing the proposal as a reckless gamble with the city's future. The rejection of austerity measures is the ideological bridge that connects Mamdani's tax plans to his affordability-focused programs. His supporters argue that the city has been trapped in a cycle of manufactured scarcity, where there is always money for corporate subsidies but never enough for public libraries or mental health services. They see the $9 billion as the key to breaking this cycle and proving that a city can be both economically vibrant and socially just. This vision of a pro-resident budget is designed to appeal to a younger, more progressive electorate that is increasingly disillusioned with traditional centrist policies. On the contrary, the opposition frames the rejection of austerity as a total abandonment of fiscal discipline. They argue that without the pressure of budget constraints, the city government will become even more bloated and inefficient. They fear that the new revenue will simply be used to fund a massive expansion of the bureaucracy rather than improving the quality of life for ordinary citizens. This perspective suggests that the real path to affordability is not through higher taxes, but through a radical simplification of the city's regulatory and spending habits. They advocate for a back-to-basics approach that prioritizes public safety and infrastructure over social engineering. As the political pressure mounts, the technicalities of the proposed tax changes are being scrutinized by analysts across the spectrum. Some independent think tanks have warned that the $9 billion estimate may be overly optimistic, failing to account for the complex ways that corporations shield their income. They suggest that the actual revenue could be significantly lower, leaving a massive hole in the mayoral's ambitious spending plans. This potential for a budgetary bait-and-switch is a major talking point for those who favor a more cautious, incremental approach to tax reform. Mamdani supporters counter these claims by emphasizing the transparency and accountability measures built into their proposal. They argue that by clearly earmarking the new revenue for specific affordability programs, they can build the public trust necessary for such a bold shift. They believe that New Yorkers are willing to support higher taxes if they can see a direct, tangible benefit in their daily lives, such as lower rent or better transit. This social contract approach to taxation is a radical departure from the opaque budgeting processes of the past. The clash over the $9 billion projection is more than just a disagreement over numbers. It is a battle for the soul of the city's economic future. One side sees it as the necessary fuel for a social revolution that will finally make New York affordable for everyone. The other side sees it as a destructive force that will drive away the capital and talent that make the city great. As the debate moves into its next phase, the focus will likely shift to the specific affordability programs that these billions are meant to fund. The tension in the city's political theater has moved beyond abstract tax brackets and into the tangible promises of social service expansion. Zohran Mamdani's administration has staked its legitimacy on a suite of affordability initiatives designed to provide immediate relief to a city squeezed by inflation. Central to this vision is the proposal for universal free childcare and a citywide fare-free bus program, funded by the projected tax windfalls. Supporters argue that these programs are not subsidies but essential investments in the city's human capital that will pay dividends in labor participation. They frame the current system, where a significant portion of a working family's income goes to childcare, as an unsustainable barrier to economic mobility. From this perspective, the government must act as a guarantor of basic needs to prevent the total displacement of the working class. However, Nicole Malliotakis has emerged as a fierce critic of these universal promises, labeling them as a gateway to fiscal insolvency and bureaucratic overreach. She argues that free is a misnomer that hides the true cost borne by taxpayers who are already struggling to keep their heads above water. Malliotakis emphasizes that while the rhetoric focuses on the 1%, the reality of large-scale social programs often leads to middle-class tax hikes or a decline in service quality. She points to the potential for massive wait lists and underfunded facilities that could result from a government-run childcare monopoly. In her view, the focus should be on expanding tax credits and empowering private providers rather than dismantling the market in favor of a socialist model. The debate over the free bus initiative has become a lightning rod for broader concerns about the Metropolitan Transportation Authority's already precarious financial state. Andrew Cuomo, leveraging his experience with state-level transit oversight, has warned that Mamdani's plan ignores the operational complexities of the MTA. He argues that eliminating fares without a guaranteed, permanent funding stream from Albany is a recipe for service cuts and deferred maintenance. Cuomo suggests that New Yorkers value reliability and safety over a free ride that comes at the cost of crumbling infrastructure. He characterizes the proposal as a bumper sticker slogan that fails to address the underlying structural deficit that has plagued the transit system for decades. This critique highlights the divide between the progressive desire for radical access and the centrist focus on institutional stability. In the realm of housing, Mamdani's call for a citywide rent freeze for rent-stabilized units has ignited a firestorm among property owners and real estate developers. Proponents of the freeze argue that it is the only way to prevent a catastrophic wave of evictions and maintain the city's cultural diversity. They believe that the real estate industry has profited enough from the housing crisis and that it is time for the city to prioritize housing as a human right. They view the opposition from landlords not as a legitimate economic concern but as a desperate attempt to protect profit margins at the expense of human dignity. This narrative positions the administration as a shield for the millions of New Yorkers who live in constant fear of being priced out of their neighborhoods. Conversely, critics like Malliotakis and Cuomo warn that a blanket rent freeze will lead to the physical deterioration of the city's housing stock. They argue that without the ability to adjust rents to cover rising insurance, energy, and maintenance costs, small-scale landlords will be forced to abandon their buildings. This, they claim, will eventually lead to a decline in housing quality and a further reduction in the overall supply of affordable units. Cuomo often speaks of the unintended consequences of well-meaning but economically blunt policies, suggesting that the city should instead focus on massive new construction and targeted rental assistance. The fear among the opposition is that Mamdani's approach will create slums of the future by making it impossible for owners to reinvest in their properties. The administration's plan to raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour by 2030 is another pillar of the Affordability Agenda that has polarized the business community. Supporters claim that such a wage is a necessity for living in one of the world's most expensive cities and will stimulate the local economy through increased spending. They dismiss the warnings of job losses, citing historical data that shows minimum wage increases often lead to higher productivity and lower turnover. To them, a business model that cannot afford to pay a living wage is fundamentally flawed and should not be subsidized by the poverty of its workers. This bold stance has galvanized low-wage workers but has sent shockwaves through the small business sector. In response, Nicole Malliotakis has become the voice of the city's entrepreneurs, particularly in boroughs like Staten Island and Queens. She argues that a $30 minimum wage would be a death sentence for thousands of mom-and-pop shops, bodegas, and restaurants that operate on razor-thin margins. She envisions a city where local businesses are replaced by automated kiosks or shuttered storefronts, robbing neighborhoods of their character and vitality. Malliotakis emphasizes that the cost of labor is just one of many rising expenses, including commercial rent and electricity, that the Mamdani administration seems to ignore. Her critique centers on the idea that the affordability being promised to workers will ultimately cost them their jobs. Beyond the specific programs, the debate has shifted to the psychological impact on the city's middle class, who often feel caught in the crossfire of this ideological war. Many moderate voters are wary of the tax the rich rhetoric, fearing that they will eventually be redefined as the rich by an ever-expanding government. Andrew Cuomo has tapped into this anxiety, presenting himself as a defender of the rational center against what he calls extremist experiments. He argues that New York's greatness is built on a diverse economy that welcomes everyone from the street vendor to the hedge fund manager. By framing Mamdani as a threat to this delicate ecosystem, Cuomo seeks to build a coalition of voters who desire progress without the risk of radical disruption. The administration counters this by arguing that the middle class is actually the primary beneficiary of their policies. They point out that a middle-income family would save thousands of dollars a year under the childcare and transit plans, far more than any marginal tax increase they might experience. They frame their agenda as middle-class relief that is finally being funded by the people at the very top. This messaging is designed to neutralize the capital flight narrative by highlighting the immediate, tangible improvements to the quality of life for the majority of residents. The battle for the middle-class vote is thus a battle of competing definitions of what affordability really means in a 21st century metropolis. As these programs move from the campaign trail to the budget office, the technical feasibility of each proposal will be tested. Independent auditors are already questioning the sustainability of free services in an environment of rising interest rates and potential federal funding cuts. The Mamdani team remains defiant, insisting that the wealth of the city is more than enough to cover the costs if the political will exists to take it. This confidence is seen by supporters as a refreshing change from years of excuse-making, and by critics as a dangerous delusion. The next phase of the debate will likely focus on the role of the state and federal governments in either facilitating or blocking this radical new direction for New York City. The grand ambitions of the Mamdani administration face their most daunting obstacle not in the streets of New York City, but in the legislative halls of Albany. Under the home rule provisions of the New York State Constitution, the city remains a creature of the state, possessing limited autonomy to alter its own tax structure. Any move to increase the personal income tax on high earners or to overhaul corporate tax rates requires explicit authorization from the state legislature and the governor's signature. Supporters of the plan argue that the state has a moral obligation to grant this taxing authority to help the city navigate its affordability crisis. They view the current legal framework as an archaic relic that allows suburban and upstate legislators to hold the city's economic future hostage. This battle for fiscal sovereignty is framed as a necessary struggle for local democracy against an overbearing state apparatus. However, Nicole Malliotakis has emerged as a staunch defender of state-level oversight, arguing that the city cannot be allowed to act as a fiscal rogue state. She contends that the home rule limitations exist precisely to prevent radical municipal experiments from destabilizing the entire state's economy. Malliotakis warns that if New York City is granted the power to hike taxes at will, it will create a disaster zone that affects the credit rating of the entire Empire State. She advocates for the state to use its power of the purse to force the city into meaningful budget cuts rather than enabling more spending. In her view, the legislative gatekeepers in Albany are the last line of defense for the overtaxed residents of the outer boroughs. The political reality in Albany is further complicated by the presence of Andrew Cuomo, whose deep knowledge of state-local dynamics serves as a cautionary counterweight. Cuomo has consistently pointed out that even a progressive-leaning state legislature is often wary of authorizing massive city tax hikes that could alienate their own moderate constituents. He argues that the Mamdani administration is drastically underestimating the political price required to move such legislation through the state Senate and Assembly. Cuomo suggests that the $9 billion dream will likely be whittled down to a fraction of its size during the grueling budget negotiations in the spring. He characterizes the administration's strategy as legislative malpractice, promising the public a windfall that the state constitution is designed to block. Legal experts have also raised concerns about the gift and loan clause and other constitutional restrictions that might prevent the city from directly redistributing tax revenue into universal programs. Proponents of the tax hike dismiss these as loyally excuses intended to preserve the status quo of inequality. They argue that the state has broad latitude to define public purpose, and that addressing the affordability crisis is the ultimate public good. They are prepared to wage a protracted legal battle in the Court of Appeals to redefine the limits of municipal power in the 21st century. This legalistic struggle is seen by many as a fight for the very soul of New York's governing philosophy. On the other hand, the opposition is already preparing a wave of litigation to challenge any tax increase that bypasses traditional legislative norms. Nicole Malliotakis has hinted at a taxpayer revolt led by small business owners and community leaders who feel ignored by the city's radical shift. She argues that the city's attempts to realign corporate taxes with New Jersey could violate the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution by unfairly burdening interstate business. This strategy aims to tie up the Mamdani agenda in the courts for years, effectively neutralizing its impact before a single dollar is collected. For the opposition, the legal system is a vital tool to protect the productive class from what they describe as unconstitutional confiscation. The tension between the City Hall and the governor's mansion has reached a level of toxicity not seen in decades. While the governor has expressed support for the concept of affordability, the specific mechanisms of the Mamdani plan remain a bridge too far for the state's executive branch. Supporters of the mayor-elect view the governor's hesitation as a betrayal of the progressive movement and a surrender to the real estate lobby. They are threatening to run primary challenges against state legislators who refuse to stand with the city. This intra-party warfare threatens to paralyze the state's legislative agenda and leave the city's budget in a state of permanent uncertainty. Critics like Andrew Cuomo warn that this all-nothing approach to Albany will backfire, leaving the city with no new revenue and a broken relationship with its most important partner. He argues that effective governance requires a theology of the possible rather than a list of impossible demands. Cuomo advocates for a more incremental approach, such as targeted tax credits or smaller, temporary surcharges, which he believes would be more palatable to state lawmakers. His critique centers on the idea that the Mamdani administration is more interested in performative politics than in the actual hard work of passing a budget. The divide between the city's movement politics and the state's transactional politics is a central theme of this part. As the budget deadline in Albany approaches, the rhetoric of autonomy and sovereignty continues to escalate on both sides. The Mamdani team is organizing mass rallies and digital campaigns to pressure state lawmakers into submission. They believe that the sheer force of public opinion will be enough to break the Albany blockade. Their opponents, however, are betting that the quiet influence of the business community and the legal reality of the state constitution will prevail. This standoff has created a sense of fiscal cliff anxiety that hangs over every discussion of the city's future. The debate also touches on the role of the federal government, particularly regarding the state and local tax, SALT, deduction. Nicole Malliotakis has been a key figure in federal negotiations to raise the SALT cap, arguing that this is the true path to relief for New Yorkers. She contends that the city's focus should be on reducing the federal burden rather than adding more local layers. Supporters of Mamdani, however, view the SALT debate as a distraction from the core issue of domestic wealth redistribution. They argue that even with a full SALT deduction, the city would still be woefully underfunded compared to its needs. In the final analysis of this part, the Albany Gauntlet represents a fundamental test of the Mamdani administration's theory of change. Can a municipal government use its moral authority to force a constitutional realignment of its fiscal powers? Or is the state's oversight a permanent and necessary check on local radicalism? The answers to these questions will determine whether the affordability-focused budget becomes a reality or remains a historical footnote. As both sides dig in, the only certainty is that the path to $9 billion runs directly through a political minefield in the state capital. As the dust begins to settle on the initial policy skirmishes, the focus of the debate has shifted toward the multi-generational impact of Zohran Mamdani's proposed social contract. Proponents of the administration argue that the New York experiment is not just about balancing a single year's budget, but about reversing a half-century of middle-class erosion. They envision a city where the brain drain is halted not by low taxes, but by a high quality of life that is accessible to everyone, from baristas to biomedical researchers. By institutionalizing universal childcare and a fare-free transit system, they believe New York will create a new economic moat, one based on a resilient, stable, and deeply rooted workforce. This perspective posits that the ultimate measure of a city's success is its ability to foster social mobility, and that the $9 billion tax shift is the necessary fuel for this engine of progress. In stark contrast, Nicole Malliotakis paints a far bleaker picture of the city's long-term trajectory if these policies are fully enacted. She warns of a vicious cycle of dependency where the ever-increasing cost of social programs requires even higher taxes, which in turn drives away the remaining tax base. Malliotakis argues that New York risks becoming a prestige city that is beautiful on the surface but hollowed out economically, much like a museum of its former self. She points to the historical precedents of cities that ignored fiscal discipline in favor of ideological purity, suggesting that the Mamdani era could be remembered as the beginning of a prolonged period of decline. Her vision of the future is one where the city's legendary ambition is replaced by a stifling bureaucracy that manages decline rather than fostering growth. Adding a layer of seasoned pragmatism to the long-term outlook, Andrew Cuomo emphasizes the role of New York as a global financial hub that cannot afford to be an island of isolationist fiscal policy. He argues that the city's future is inextricably linked to its ability to attract international capital and talent in an increasingly competitive world. Cuomo suggests that while the affordability goals are noble, the methods proposed by the Mamdani administration could inadvertently damage the city's reputation for reliability and predictability. He advocates for a strategic modernization of the city's economy that leverages technology and public-private partnerships rather than relying solely on the tax code. To Cuomo, the soul of New York is its dynamism, and any policy that prioritizes equity at the total expense of efficiency threatens the very foundation of that dynamism. The debate also delves into the demographic shifts that could be triggered by a radical realignment of the city's wealth. Supporters of the rent freeze and the $30 minimum wage argue that these measures will preserve the authentic New York, preventing the total Disneyfication of Manhattan and the outer boroughs. They see the survival of immigrant communities and the working poor as essential to the city's cultural and economic vitality. Without these protections, they argue, New York will become a gated community for the global elite, losing its creative spark and its democratic character. This narrative frames the administration's fiscal policy as an existential defense of the city's identity against the forces of hypergentrification. However, critics like Malliotakis and Cuomo warn of a different kind of demographic shift, one where the aspirational class of professionals and small business owners simply gives up on the city. They argue that the $30 minimum wage, while well-intentioned, will accelerate the automation of service jobs and make it impossible for young entrepreneurs to start new ventures. They envision a future where the city is divided between a protected class of government-supported residents and a shrinking group of overburdened taxpayers. This barbell economy, they claim, is inherently unstable and will eventually lead to a collapse of the social services that the administration is so eager to expand. For them, the path to a vibrant future is through abundance and opportunity, not redistribution and regulation. As the legal and political battles in Albany continue, the role of federal policy also looms large in the city's long-term planning. The potential for further changes to the tax code or shifts in federal grant programs could either provide a windfall for the city or create a devastating funding gap. Supporters of Mamdani remain optimistic that the city's bold stance will inspire a national movement toward progressive taxation, potentially unlocking new federal resources. Their opponents, however, are betting that the federal government will eventually have to step in to bail out a city that has spent its way into a corner. This geopolitical dimension adds another layer of complexity to an already fraught domestic debate. The environmental impact of the administration's Green New Deal for New York also plays a significant role in the long-term vision. By investing the tax revenue into green infrastructure and sustainable housing, proponents believe the city can become a global leader in climate resilience. They argue that the cost of inaction is far higher than the cost of the proposed taxes, and that the transition to a green economy will create thousands of high-paying union jobs. This triple bottom-line approach, focused on social, environmental, and economic health, is the cornerstone of their pitch to the next generation of New Yorkers. They believe that a city that is not sustainable is, by definition, not affordable in the long run. Conversely, the opposition frames the green initiatives as another example of unfunded mandates that will drive up the cost of living for everyone. They argue that the city's focus should be on practical, market-based solutions to climate change rather than massive government-directed projects. They worry that the green agenda will be used as a pretext for even more government control over the housing and energy markets. This clash over the cost of the future highlights the fundamental disagreement over whether the government or the private sector is best equipped to solve the most pressing challenges of the 21st century. As the first term of the Mamdani administration nears its conclusion, the reality of the $9 billion projection will finally be known. If the revenue materializes and the programs succeed, it could mark a historic turning point in American municipal governance. If, however, the warnings of capital flight and economic stagnation prove true, the city may find itself in a period of painful retrenchment. The voters of New York will ultimately be the judge of whether the affordability-focused budget was a bold step forward or a costly mistake. Their decision will resonate far beyond the 5 boroughs, shaping the political landscape of cities across the globe for years to come. The ultimate conclusion of this ideological war is that there are no easy answers in a city as complex and dynamic as New York. Both sides have articulated a vision for the future that is rooted in a deep love for the city, yet they differ fundamentally on how to preserve its greatness. One side sees the path to prosperity through the collective power of the state and the redistribution of wealth. The other sees it through the individual power of the market and the protection of incentives. As the city navigates the uncertainties of the coming decade, the only constant will be the passion and the persistence of the New Yorkers who continue to fight for their version of the greatest city in the world.